This is the new 2022 Cadillac CT4-V Blackwing. And it's an impressive sports sedan. It has 475 horsepower, just like the new BMW M3. And it comes with a manual transmission and rear-wheel drive, just like the new BMW M3. But while the new M3 starts around $70,000, this starts around $60,000. So today I'm going to review the CT4-V Blackwing and find out if it's a good substitute for the new M3. Before we get started, be sure to check out Cars and Bids, which is my enthusiast car auction website for cool cars from the modern era. We've had some great sales recently on Cars and Bids, including this Mercedes E63 AMG wagon, which sold for over $58,000. This Shelby GT350R fantastic car brought $80,000. And this beautiful Porsche 996 Turbo yellow with a manual transmission sold for $57,000. If you're looking to sell your cool, modern enthusiast car, Cars and Bids is the place to do it. And if you're looking to buy a cool car from the modern era, the 1980s and up, Cars and Bids has a great selection with daily auctions at carsandbids.com. So let's talk CT4-V Blackwing. Cadillac now has two ultra-high performance sedans. I reviewed the other one, the CT5-V Blackwing, recently, and that one's a little bit more special. 680 horsepower, big V8, the ultimate Cadillac performance sedan, the ultimate General Motors performance sedan, frankly. Now, the CT4-V Blackwing, this car isn't quite as impressive as the CT5, but it's still pretty cool. This replaces the old Cadillac ATS-V, and it has the same engine. It's a twin-turbo V6. In this car, 475 horsepower and about 445 pound-feet of torque. And yes, you can get this with a 6-speed manual transmission, although an automatic is also available. This will do 0 to 60 in the high 3-second range, and it'll run the quarter mile in the low 12s. It's not CT5-V Blackwing fast, but it's still fast. And it's a direct competitor to the new BMW M3, which, like I said, also has 475 horsepower, also rear-wheel drive, manual transmission, about the same size. They're very close rivals. Now, I love the new M3, so I'm very curious to review this and find out how it compares. First, I'll take you on a little tour of the CT4-V Blackwing and show you some of its interesting quirks and features. Then I'll get it out on the road and drive it, and then I'll give it a Doug's score. All right, time for the quirks and features of the CT4-V Blackwing. Now, I'm not going to go over everything because I just did a very comprehensive review of the CT5-V Blackwing, and a lot of stuff is exactly the same or very similar. So I'm only going to go over the highlights and some differences between the two cars. And I want to start with one of my favorite highlights, and that would be the key, which you'll notice is blue, which seems kind of strange because this car is very much orange. They don't really match. You're wondering why? It's because the key matches the brake calipers in these V Blackwing models. You look closely, you can see the brake caliper is blue, same blue as the key, but not the same color as the car. So if you get one of these, you're wondering why your key is such a different color from your car, that's the reason. It matches the brakes, not the car itself. And next up, we move inside the CT4-V Blackwing, and I gotta say, this interior is very similar to the one in the CT5-V Blackwing. In fact, it's pretty much identical. Aside from those weird 4-color seats, everything else in here is largely the same, which kind of amplifies my criticism of the CT5-V Blackwing's materials. This car is $40,000 cheaper than the 5V Blackwing, and yet everything in here looks pretty much the same. That's not really ideal for a CT5-V Blackwing model over $110,000, and it has the same interior as this. Bit of a disappointment in that car, although it works pretty well in here, given this car is probably $75,000 price point. And of course, by sharing an interior with the CT5-V Blackwing, this car has some very cool features, starting with the manual transmission. Yes, a manual, old school 6-speed with this strange medallion on top, as you can see, mated to rear-wheel drive. That's a very cool touch. And around the gear lever, you can see the rev match button. You press that and it will turn on rev matching. So every time you downshift, it'll rev up to give you a perfect, smooth, comfortable downshift. You also have your drive mode switch around the gear selector. You can use this to go through your drive modes, although, again, just like in the CT5-V Blackwing, Blackwing, you have a little V button coming off the steering wheel here. You can press that and instantly go into V mode, which is this programmable high-performance drive mode that's very accessible, being right there within a thumb's reach on your steering wheel. You can go from like your most comfortable mode possible to V mode without ever taking your hand off the wheel in case you just happen to find yourself on one of your favorite roads. Also on the steering wheel, you have this little switch here which adjusts your performance traction control system, and you can go through various different levels of traction control intervention. You can even go into race mode, which probably turns it off completely, which is a pretty terrifying proposition. And worth noting, just like the CT4-V Blackwing, you also have this gauge cluster screen with its very configurable gauge cluster screen layout. You can see right now I'm in track mode, which vastly emphasizes like your gear and your RPMs and kind of de-emphasizes your speed, and it gives you a lot more information you might want on the racetrack. And of course you can change the gauge cluster to various other different modes in case you want to tone it down a little bit. If you're not doing your very highest performance driving, you can have kind of a more mellow gauge cluster experience. Sort of a neat trick with having that gauge cluster screen. Also in this car, and also matching the CT4-V Blackwing, you get a little plaque at the base of the steering wheel. It says 26-009. 009 is the VIN of this car. I guess it's the 9th one built, and 26 is the model code for a CT4-V Blackwing with a manual transmission. And it's kind of cool to get that little plaque. You got to kind of speak the language to understand it, but once you do, it's neat to see it there. And speaking of badging, you also get the little Blackwing badges on the seats. These tiny little subtle badges are there if you know where to look for them, reminding you and your passengers that you're not in a regular CT4, you're in the Blackwing. By the way, speaking of the seats, that is one big distinction compared to the CT4-V Blackwing. You don't get those crazy carbon fiber bucket seats. These are the seats in the CT4-V Blackwing. You can see very carbon fiber buckety. These are the seats in this car, not as carbon fiber buckety. Now, they're still pretty aggressive seats, and they have holes near the headrest for a racing harness to go through if you want to use one, but doesn't have the same like carbon fiber bucket seat approach that you get in the 5V Blackwing. Of course, since we're talking differences between the CT4-V Blackwing and the CT5-V, should discuss the biggest difference, which is under the hood. Now, the CT5-V Blackwing has that big supercharged V8, 680 horsepower. This car has a twin-turbo V6. This is the same engine that was in the old ATS-V, although this has a little bit more horsepower, 475 horsepower in this car compared to, I think, 465 horsepower in the ATS-V, and torque is about the same at 445 pound-feet. Now, that's nowhere near the crazy 670 horsepower the CT5-V Blackwing, but this is a smaller car, and this engine still propels it pretty well. 0 to 60 in the high 3-second range, not so bad with this car. I am a little disappointed, though, that you don't have the plaque on the engine showing who built it. You have that in the CT5-V Blackwing, you can see it here, but on the CT4-V Blackwing, you just have your typical plastic engine cover, kind of reminding you that this isn't quite as special of a car or as special of an engine. And since we're talking big differences between the CT4 and the CT5-V Blackwing, another major one, and very noticeable, is rear seat room. There's just not as much of it in this car. The CT5-V Blackwing, definitely the one you want if you plan to carry adults or frankly any rear passengers all that frequently. There's just not all that much legroom, knee room back here. It's simply smaller than the 5. With that said, I do think I actually have a little bit more headroom in this car than I did in the CT5-V. That one has more of a sloping roof line and it kind of steals some of your headroom, but in this car I can generally sit up straight without my head quite touching the ceiling, and that one I was kind of ducking a little bit. But leg room in here pretty tight, and these hard back seats aren't exactly helping. In some cars you can kind of push your legs in, get a little more leg room. Not here, because these sport seats are so hard, you're kind of digging right into them with your knees. Not much rear seat room. Now otherwise back here everything is fairly standard. You have a couple of vents for climate, you have a couple of charge ports and some cup holders that come down from the center armrest. Not really anything too special or unusual in the back seat of the 4V Blackwing. And finally, we move outside the CT4-V Blackwing, and specifically to the back, where you see one big detail shared with the CT5-V. That would be the quad exhaust. 4 exhaust tips, although it doesn't quite sound as good as its V8 engined bigger brother. Take a listen. Still Still sounds good, but not quite massive supercharged V8 good. Now, the other thing to note back here is this spoiler, massive carbon fiber spoiler, and I actually think it's bigger than the spoiler on the CT4-V Blackwing. It's like the only thing that's really a benefit or an improvement in this car, this massive spoiler. That's part of all of the carbon fiber options that this car has. This CT4-V Blackwing has over $9,000 in carbon accessories. This spoiler is one piece. Obviously, the carbon rear diffuser is another with the quad exhaust, but they are everywhere. The rocker panels going down the side, also a massive piece of carbon fiber on both sides, and in front you can see this carbon fiber lower front splitter and carbon fiber canards on the sides of the bumper for even more of a sporty, racy look to this car. Over $9 grand in carbon to make this especially bold and performancy. All right, time to drive the CT4-V Blackwing. I gotta tell you, this thing is pretty cool. Now, it's a little bit unfortunate. I think the CT4-V Blackwing is going to suffer a little bit because it was released at the exact same time as the CT5-V Blackwing, and most of the journalists drove them together, myself included. This car is not the car that the CT5-V Blackwing is. It just isn't. It's not as fast, not as loud, not as fun, but it's still amazing, and it's such a shame that they're going to inevitably be compared, as I've done throughout this entire video. Truthfully, these cars are no more comparable than an M3 and an M5, which not that many people are cross-shopping because the price points are so different. But because they're coming out literally at the same week, you have to compare. It just makes the most sense. In fact, the Cadillac launch event for this car was also the launch event for the CT5-V Blackwing. It's just what it is. They're inextricably linked. But let me tell you my thoughts on this car. First off, I love the new BMW M3. In fact, I've gotten in trouble with my friends for saying this, but I think it might be the best M3 ever. It's ugly, I understand that, but it's the end of an era, the last of a dynasty in terms of manual transmission, this rear-wheel drive, pre-hybrid, smaller engine stuff. It is a really special car. And so it's going to take a lot to dethrone the new M3, in my opinion. And this car doesn't quite do it, to be totally honest. It's great in a lot of ways, but it's not quite new M3 great. The interior, in my opinion, is one of the big letdowns here. It's nice in here, but it's just not that great. The CT5-V Blackwing had the same problem, and this one does too. You get into a BMW, a Mercedes-Benz, those cars are just a lot nicer. And someone who's spending what this car costs, $75,000 or $80,000 as equipped, they want nice stuff. A lot of people watch these videos say, I don't need nice equipment and nice features, I just want a fast car. Well, those people don't tend to actually be buyers of these cars. The people who want to actually spend 80 grand on a sports sedan do tend to want nice stuff, and some of them might be disappointed in this car. But Cadillac is making a big bet that there are a lot of people who are more interested in the fun aspect, the rear-wheel drive, manual transmission, big power aspect of this car. And that is certainly a nice thing. And this is a great powertrain. I really like the way that this twin-turbo V6 builds power. It feels very torquey. It feels very powerful at pretty much every step of the rev range. It is a good, in fact, maybe even great engine, and I think it is seriously comparable to that new M3. And there's other cool stuff here too. I mean, the engine note is just marvelous. Again, not as good as the CT5-V Blackwing, but it still sounds pretty damn good, better than the M3, I think. But things kind of fall apart a little bit after that. The engine is good, the engine note is good, and the price point is good. And those are all really big benefits. However, this car certainly doesn't handle quite like the new M3. I think that has much more of a sports car feel to it. It feels a lot more immediate. I wouldn't say that this car is lazy by any stretch of the imagination, but it just doesn't quite feel as precise. It feels a little more over-assisted, and the precision of the steering isn't quite there. You also have the problem with the technology. The tech in this car is fine. I mean, the new GM infotainment is actually pretty good, but I don't know, it doesn't seem befitting a luxury car. This is the same system they use in a lot of Chevys, and it's just not quite there, what I would say, compared to Mercedes-Benz and BMW have much more advanced technology. Now, in terms of ride quality in this car, I find it to be pretty good, more comfortable than you might expect given all the performance-y stuff with this. It's nice up here. Obviously, I mentioned earlier, in terms of comfort, the rear seat, not really all that nice, pretty cramped back there, but you kind of understand that going into a car like this. But overall, I think there's a lot of good stuff here, and if you're a little bit more price conscious, you maybe don't want to stretch for a really nice M3, but you want to buy a great one of these, you can get this plus a lot of options for the cost of a middling M3, and I think that's a pretty big deal. This is a good car, and it still represents a great value, just like the ATS-V did. And so that's the 2022 Cadillac CT4-V Blackwing. It's no new M3, but it's still pretty good. It looks good, and manual transmission, rear-wheel drive, it's cool. Frankly, I'm just glad it exists in today's world of crossovers and increasingly small and hybrid engines. This is a neat car, and now it's time to give the CT4-V Blackwing a DOUGSCORE. And the DOUGSCORE is here, 65 out of 100, which places the CT4-V Blackwing in a good spot against rivals. It doesn't quite match the BMW M3 in terms of fun factor, handling, or quality, but the Cadillac is still a good competitor, and the CT4-V Blackwing also holds its own against other important rivals like the Audi RS5 Sportback and BMW M2 competition. Overall, this Cadillac is a neat car, and along with the CT5-V Blackwing I recently reviewed, it represents the end of an era.